When he was led out of his cell into the damp corridor of the Lubyanka's inner prison, the first thing he noticed was not the cold or the fear, but a strange silence. Beyond the thick walls, the morning city came to life. Occasional cars hummed, streetcar wheels rumbled distantly. But here, in the heart of the state machine, a tense soundlessness reigned. His gaze momentarily caught on the chevron on the guard's sleeve, and almost automatically, his mind filled in the familiar front line, the command post, the map, the arrows of offensives. Not long ago, he had commanded a corps, planned maneuvers, demanded precision and decisiveness from his commanders. Now, his footsteps echoed on the stone floor, and he was being led not to a report, not to a meeting, and not to the district headquarters. Beyond the door he was approaching, he awaited not a new operation, but the final role in a foreign script, where every word had already been written without him. At that moment, he first distinctly felt that his own fate had become part of a much larger process, where human biographies were transformed into evidence in favor of a pre-formulated accusation. A few years before this day, his name had sounded quite differently. Ivan Uganov belonged to that generation of commanders who, during the Civil War years, were accustomed to living in the saddle and on the march, giving orders amidst the roar of artillery and the clang of armored train runners. His biography was composed of motives typical of that time: revolutionary fervor, voluntary enlistment in the Red Army, rapid advancement against a backdrop of general chaos. In the early 1920s, he already commanded large formations, belonging to the circle of those whom the Army called Red Devils, fearless field commanders accustomed to deciding the outcome of battles on the front lines. In the years when the memory of the old Army was still fresh, these men seemed to embody the new officer corps. Without pedigrees, without the old-style generals' epaulets, but with a reputation as men of action who were not afraid of responsibility. They were recognized by name, cited as examples to young commanders, written about in reports, and mentioned at rallies. However, from the mid-1930s, the very logic of the Red Army's life began to change. The idealized heroism of the Civil War gradually gave way to harsh, bureaucratic reality. Military careers began to be determined not only by personal courage and the ability to lead men into battle, but also by the subtle politics of loyalty. At the top, a dangerous divergence of logic was forming. The more renowned a commander, the more his merits, the more he stood out from the general background, and the easier he could be seen either as a pillar of the regime or as a potential threat. Before the eyes of the entire officer corps, a renewal of the command elite was taking place, where some rapidly climbed the career ladder, while others began to be unexpectedly transferred, removed, or summoned to Moscow for consultations. Rumors hung in the air about a conspiracy in the high military command, about hidden ties with the opposition still existing among commanders, about the echoes of old factional disputes not disappearing but merely going underground. These rumors took concrete shape when major trials were announced against former party leaders accused of creating a unified Trotskyite Zinovievite center. Official reports claimed that, in accordance with Leon Trotsky's instructions, an underground network had been created with the aim of eliminating the party and government leadership, as well as undermining the country's defense capability. It is noteworthy that even then, the accusatory formulations included words about connections with military circles, about attempts to penetrate command structures to turn the army into an instrument of a possible coup. While this sounded like a general backdrop, for those who served in the highest echelons of the Red Army, each such mention became an ominous signal. It meant that the political struggle, which only recently seemed to be the domain of the party apparatus, was beginning to engulf the military sphere as well. The culmination of this turning point was the case of Marshal Mikhail Tukhachevsky and a group of high-ranking commanders, which in 37th year became an exemplary judicial act against the very top of the army. The essence of the accusations brought against these individuals boiled down to the creation of a military organization with the aim of undermining the country's defense capability, entering into contact with foreign military circles, and preparing a military coup. To give the process an appearance of objectivity and magnitude, a special court composition was created under the Supreme Court, which included famous marshals and army commanders, whose presence was intended to confirm the collective assessment of what was happening. At the sessions, some of them demonstratively supported the prosecution, thereby emphasizing that the army was allegedly purging its own ranks of a dangerous element. But even then, a paradox was hidden in this construct. Many of those who sat in the judges' chairs would themselves, within a few months and years, find themselves in the dock or in the basements of the same prisons, which turned the entire system into a closed circle of self-devouring trust. Uganov gradually finds himself in this circle as well. His path to a conviction was not a swift fall after a single episode, but a sequential series of steps, each of which individually might have seemed almost an ordinary service story. Transfer from one district to another, change of position, a sudden summons to Moscow for consultations on combat training issues. All of this, in the usual army logic, was perceived as routine work. But it was in the Urals, where he served in a command position, that a picture gradually began to form, which the investigation would later present as proof of the existence of a hidden opposition network among the command staff and worker units. Reports of unhealthy sentiments in some regiments, criticism of the leadership, and inappropriate remarks in officer circles began to appear in the political department summaries. Each such note was placed in a folder, and over time, these folders became the basis for the prosecution's case. A special role in this construct was played by the worker regiments of the Ural district, where the tradition of military service was closely intertwined with memories of the revolutionary struggle and the Committee of the Poor. Among the soldiers and junior commanders, stories still lived about the first Red commanders, who, during the Civil War, knew not only how to build attacks, but also to speak before workers, to speak the language of a rally. It was against this backdrop that the figure of Uganov, a former field commander from the Civil War, was perceived by many as the embodiment of old frontline honesty. He knew how to appeal to the personal experience of the fighters, spoke of the difficult years spent in battles, recalled how in the early 20s, units literally tore positions with their bare hands, how legendary units were formed, which were later nicknamed Red Devils in the army. For soldiers who grew up in peacetime, such stories created the illusion of a direct connection to a heroic past, where everything seemed clearer, and the front lines were more understandable than the blurred boundaries of the ideological disputes of the mid-30s. However, it was precisely this appeal to the past, to the traditions of the Civil War, and the image of a frontline commander that became one of the elements that the investigation would later use against him. In the logic of the interrogation rooms, any cohesion that went beyond the formal vertical structure, any authority based not only on official position but also on personal history, began to appear potentially dangerous. The network of trust between a commander and his soldiers, which during the Civil War was perceived as a most valuable resource, in the mid-30s turned into a cause for suspicion. If soldiers gravitate towards a specific commander, listen to him with special attention, share their doubts with him. It means he is capable of influencing the masses outside of established party channels. And if he is capable, then he can become a conduit for a different, alien line. Thus, the idea gradually arises that Uganov had a network among the workers' regiments which was allegedly used to spread opposition sentiments and connect with external centers. It was in Moscow that this idea was given legal form. By the time his case reached the level of central investigation, a general narrative about a military Trotskyist conspiracy, closely linked to previously uncovered centers in party circles, had already been formed. The interrogation protocols of other defendants involved in high-profile trials contain extensive references to contacts with military personnel, to meetings in clandestine apartments, to discussions of plans to undermine defense capabilities. These testimonies began to be used as a matrix into which new figures were fitted. Where Uganov's name was not explicitly mentioned, it could be inserted as a connecting link in the regional structure. Where commanders of the Ural district were mentioned, the investigator could specify the name based on the lists he already possessed. Thus, a model was created in which Uganov turned out to be not just a commander with a frontline past, but a key participant in the regional part of an all-union conspiracy. At the Moscow trial, where the cases of the largest political figures were heard, the theme of the opposition's connection with the army sounded particularly loud. The prosecution speeches emphasized that the activities of Trotskyist and other opposition groups were impossible without reliance on power structures, that there allegedly existed a widespread organization in the Red Army ready to take decisive action at a signal. In this scheme, regional cadres like Uganov appeared to be a necessary link. It was through such commanders, who had influence over the soldier masses, that the opposition was supposed to gain real strength. The accusatory formulations included words about secret ties with the Trotskyist center, about the deliberate creation of a network of supporters in the workers' regiments, about preparations for disorganizing the defense of strategically important areas. Each of these assertions relied on an already built system of concepts. If there is a center, it must necessarily have peripheral executors, and if the word Ural appears in the protocols, then a specific person is needed to embody this role. For Uganov himself, this transformation of his own biography into an element of someone else's logical scheme was probably the most difficult psychological test. He was accustomed to understanding war as a space of clear lines. There is a front, there is an enemy, there is a mission. In the interrogation room, everything was different. Here, he was not required to recall details of operations or explain tactical decisions. Here, he was expected to confess to participating in something he had never planned. On paper, his frontline authority was turned into proof that he could influence soldiers. His meetings with commanding staff were presented as a cover for secret meetings. His trips to units, where he checked combat readiness and discipline, were interpreted as inspection trips of a conspirator strengthening his underground network. The logic of the process was built in such a way that any attempt to bring the conversation back to the plane of real events was perceived as stubborn denial of the obvious. The paradox of this situation was that everything that made him a good commander, in the eyes of the investigation, turned into an aggravating circumstance. If he demonstrated initiative, it meant he was capable of acting independently and, therefore, dangerous. If subordinates respected and trusted him, it meant he could influence the masses, and therefore was also dangerous. If he maintained connections with former comrades in arms with whom he had fought in the Civil War, it indicated the existence of informal contacts that could be used, not along the chain of command, but in the interests of conspirators. Even his biography, rich in episodes of selfless behavior in battles, could be interpreted as a way to gain authority, only to later use it for other purposes. In these conditions, any attempt to explain the real meaning of his actions became pointless. The outcome was predetermined by the logic of an already constructed accusation. A special place in this logic was occupied by the image of the Red Devils of the Civil War, to which Uganov was counted by his comrades in arms. In the early 1920s, this nickname sounded like a sign of the highest soldier's praise. It signified brave commanders ready to take risks, assume responsibility, and perform maneuvers that seemed impossible. But a decade and a half later, the same image began to acquire a different meaning. In conditions where the authorities feared any potentially independent centers of influence, the figure of a bright, charismatic military leader with independent experience and reputation began to evoke not only respect, but also alarm. History offered too many examples of how popular field commanders turned into political players, and this was precisely what the leadership sought to avoid. Therefore, the strike against the Red Devils became not only a consequence of individual cases, but also a symbolic gesture to show that the era of frontline romanticism was finally giving way to a disciplined, rigidly controlled system. The external end of this story was short and formal. The court session that heard Uganov's case was not an independent drama, but a fragment of a larger campaign. There, familiar formulas from those years were heard about treason to the motherland, participation in a counter-revolutionary organization, and the deliberate undermining of the Red Army's combat power. The verdict was formulated in dry language, leaving no room for doubt, and was carried out soon after its announcement, as became common practice in such cases. For the official press, he became another name on the list of exposed enemies, confirmation that the investigative bodies spared no one involved in the military conspiracy. In this context, his biography ceased to be unique. Alongside him stood the names of marshals and army commanders, heroes of the Civil War, whose past merits did not save them from accusations of betrayal. But the real denouement came much later, when the political atmosphere changed and there was an opportunity to review the sentences of the 1930s. 2 decades later, the Military Collegium of the Supreme Court began the rehabilitation of commanders convicted at that time. The resolutions adopted in the late 1950s stated that no corpus delicti was found in the actions of many of them, and the investigation was conducted with gross violations of legality, including the use of pressure methods and the fabrication of confessions. For Uganov, this decision meant official recognition that the accusation of participation in a military Trotskyist conspiracy and the creation of a secret network among workers' regiments was not the result of real actions, but a product of political order and investigative practices of that time. His name was returned to the lists of Red Army commanders without mention of guilt, but this restoration came when it was already impossible to change the outcome of his personal fate. The story of Ivan Uganov does not end there, because it fits into the broader question of how the era of the Civil War, with its frontline freedom and heroism, transformed into an era when these same people began to be perceived as a potential threat. The example of one Corps commander shows how the principle of revolutionary expediency was replaced by the principle of total suspicion, where any independence and any authority had to be either integrated into a rigid vertical structure or eliminated as a possible center of alternative influence. In this sense, his case demonstrates the clash of two value systems, one in which decisiveness and responsibility were the commander's highest virtues, and another where unconditional manageability and predictability became most important. The question this story leaves for the modern reader is simple yet unanswered. Is it possible to build a stable security system when its foundation is not trust in the best personnel, but suspicion of anyone who stands out? For today's viewer, Uganov's story is not just a reconstruction of a specific case, but also an occasion to reflect on how any state treats its heroes after times of great upheaval have passed. In some years, they are held up as examples, awarded and elevated on banners. In other years, the the same names appear in reports as conspirators and traitors. And then, decades later, they are again included in the pantheon, albeit in a different political context. The cycle of recognition, accusation, and posthumous exoneration that Uganov underwent shows how fragile the connection can be between a personal biography and the official version of history. In this cycle, each new turn reveals not only facts of the past, but also the character of the era that decides who is considered a hero, who an enemy, and who a victim of its own fears. This is precisely why the story of the Corps Commander, accused of participating in a military conspiracy and ties to the opposition, resonates with our time. It reminds us that any high-profile trials, any accusations of conspiracies and secret networks, must be viewed not only as a chain of events, but also as a reflection of society's values and fears. In the 1930s, the fear of external threats and internal opponents became so great that it allowed an entire generation of experienced commanders to be turned into figures of accusation, and their biographies into illustrations for a pre-written accusatory narrative. Decades later, this same story became proof of the opposite, that a system which loses its best personnel due to suspicion undermines its own stability. This holds the main lesson of Ivan Uganov's case. The fate of one person can be the key to understanding how the state treats those who were once its shield, and then, unexpectedly, became a target. Mentally returning to that morning corridor in the Lubyanka, one can see in that scene not only a personal tragedy, but also a symbol of an entire era, where for one person everything ended with a brief sentence, for history, a long debate about what to consider truth and what a product of fear and political struggle was just beginning. Where for the command staff, one of their comrades from the Civil War disappeared, for future researchers, another piece of the mosaic was being assembled, explaining how the Red Army transitioned from the heroism of the frontline Red Devils to an era in which their names had to be brought back from oblivion years later. And in this return lies a quiet acknowledgement. Without understanding the fates of people like Ivan Uganov, it is impossible to fully comprehend that army, that time, or the price paid for the fear of imagined conspiracies.